On June 1, during Vietnamese President To Lam's state visit to the Philippines, Hanoi and Manila announced the elevation of ties to an enhanced strategic partnership. It's the first of its kind for both countries. Vietnam is the Philippines' only strategic partner, now enhanced strategic partner in ASEAN. But in the context of a world that many have accurately called fragmented or turbulent, what does this mean exactly? Hi, my name is Bekopin, and you are watching Rappler. To help us better understand the dynamics between Vietnam and the Philippines and how this possibly affects the region and the rest of the world, we have as our guest Minh Phuong Vu. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of International Relations of the Australian National University. For her doctoral thesis, she examines the evolution of Vietnam's foreign policy. Her expertise also lies in territorial disputes in the South China Sea and Southeast Asian security and alignment tendencies. It's as if she was tailor-made for this topic. She also recently attended the 23rd Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore as a young leader, where Vietnamese President To Lam was keynote speaker. That was right before his visit to Manila. Hi, Minh. Thank you for making time.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that gracious introduction. I'm not sure if I can pose myself as, the expert on the topic, but I'll try my best to provide some insightful perspective.
I'm sure we'll do more than fine. So what exactly does an enhanced strategic partnership mean in the operational and practical, tactical sense? And maybe asking ahead, what message does it send both people in Vietnam and the Philippines, and maybe ASEAN and the greater Asia Pacific?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and for starting off with some a question that is already quite difficult to answer, as you mentioned, because both Vietnam and the Philippines have not had what so-called an enhanced strategic partnership with any countries before. Now, from my sense as an observer of Vietnam's foreign policy, what I can make of the enhanced strategic partnership is that it is quite similar to perhaps a comprehensive strategic partnership which Vietnam has already have with multiple Southeast Asian countries, including Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and the Philippines has sort of very naturally emerged as the sort of the next the next candidate for this partnership, I would say. But perhaps the need to reframe this as an enhanced strategic partnership rather than a comprehensive, the traditional comprehensive partnership. I would say likely for two reasons. The first, to me, perhaps comes from the Philippine side to distinguish the comprehensive strategic partnership that it has just established with Japan, which is likely to have more of a strategic or security implication than the one that is going to have with Vietnam, considering how both the Philippines and Japan are close U.S. allies and want to work together to integrate themselves even further into U.S. security networks. Whereas with Vietnam, it probably wouldn't have such an that avenue for cooperation is less likely to be explored. So I think there's a need there to distinguish the nature of these relationship. And secondly, from Vietnam perspective, it is also it is an issue of signaling for the outside world, so that it is less likely to see too heavily in a security and maritime security light as well. So I think for Hanoi, it is to signal perhaps most likely to China that this isn't an anti-Chinese coalition. Yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Just adding in because I feel like that answer didn't really clarify, what
it was
strategic part. Yeah.
It speaks a lot, I guess, of the different dynamics that Philippines and Vietnam exist in.
Yeah. But I guess, what I was trying to perhaps get to with that, with that explanation of context is that ultimately it would, in tactical and practical terms, it would very likely be very similar to the sort of comprehensive strategic partnership that Vietnam had passed with multiple countries before. But, maybe the question lies more on the Philippine side and how, how they define,
Right.
this special relationship with Vietnam. Yes.
Right. And I guess also the
Yeah.
capacity of the Philippines, considering that, Manila has been collecting a lot of partners, whether it be
Yeah.
strategic or military in the past, 3 or 4 years. I'm going to step back a little bit and ask you to share, if you could, your reflections from President To Lam's speech before the Shangri-La. He was very frank in his
Yeah.
assessment of the international order, very blunt in pointing out stressors to existing models. And I frankly agree with this. He talked about a silent yet dangerous crisis of strategic trust or distrust. What do you
Mhm.
make of his speech? What does it say about the role Vietnam is currently playing in the region, in the world? And how do you see this? Because I'm guessing part of it is also him telegraphing to the world the kind of role Vietnam wants to play in the coming
Mhm.
years, right?
Yeah. Yes. So in regards to President To Lam address, there has been quite a bit of press around it, and I think for an understandable reason. It's not the last time that we see a Vietnamese head of state speaking at a dialogue like Shangri-La was more than 10 years ago. I believe it was 2013 when our then Prime Minister Nguyễn Tân Dũng made a speech at the Shangri-La, and from my memory, his speech was, a rather positive and diplomatic one, emphasizing the need for, strategic trust, I believe, is what was mentioned. Whereas this one that was presented by To Lam this time paints, a more perhaps, pessimistic but also very realistic picture of the world that we're residing in right now, where we're seeing increasing, conflicts, uncertainty, and fragmentation, decoupling between great powers, which led to, sort of enhance or increase likelihood of crises impacting the region, whether or not conflicts unveil in Southeast Asia or not. So I thought it was, a quite sobering remark, and quite, pragmatic and realistic in terms of its, vision for what Vietnam or what, ASEAN countries can do to sort of navigate these current dynamics. So what stood out to me, is that one part when I believe it was in To Lam answer to one of the questions when he mentioned, or perhaps at the end, towards the end of his speech, I'm sorry if I got this wrong, but where he mentioned that, competition between great powers are inevitable in his opinion. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be managed. So I think that show some what I would say is limited agency from the part of Hanoi, whereas it sees, there are certain things that it just can't be avoided. Hanoi is not stepping up on stage and, calling upon China or the U.S. to not see each other as threats. But it is stepping on that stage to tell superpowers to mitigate their competition in healthy ways that align still with rules and norms to preserve stability of Southeast Asia. So I think that is sort of the very pragmatic and realistic ambition that Hanoi's have as for its role in shaping the future of this region.
Right. I mean, if I dare say, it kind of connects to what Marco said at Shangri-La
Yeah.
2 years ago, although this was a very different world, right? Like his speech was arguably and understandably a little more optimistic perhaps in its tone, because he was talking about he, not just in Shangri-La, but in speeches before that, how the region shouldn't just be a theater of competition between China and the US. He has been rallying, as with other nations as well, like middle powers to come together and work together. I think that if there is something optimistic to be taken from the Vietnamese president's speech, I think that was the call to action. But that's a good assessment. You know, like there's admission that we can't control what China and the US does, but we can control how we react or how we work together. But so on that note, given that seeming alignment, I suppose, of the limited agency that admittedly smaller powers have, even in our own backyards, where do you see countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and maybe other ASEAN members coming together to perhaps shape the region in the way that it wants it to be shaped?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's definitely an interesting one that, perhaps can only be answered by time. But, I guess traditionally there hasn't been a lot of, especially from, the academic and analyst side of things, there hasn't been a lot of trust in ASEAN as an organization, being able to function, with consensus and come to meaningful agreements. That being said, I think perhaps at the moment it's just a little bit early to tell whether or not Southeast Asian countries can shape the dynamic in its own region. But I think what I'm observing and seeing right now is it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to the conflicts and all the supply chain disruption that we have seen ever since COVID, is that countries are actually turning toward each other rather than outside. So I guess, for the past couple of decades, Southeast Asian economy has benefited greatly from, from increasing economic interdependence. This is how a lot of the economies and especially, economies like Vietnam have grown and enjoy prosperity over the past 20 years or so, is by, inserting itself into the global supply chain and benefiting from that, interdependency and integration. But what we're seeing right now is a breakdown, of this order. I mean, countries are still very much interdependent, like what we heard echo in the Shangri-La Dialogue. However, that interdependence is not being necessarily seen as always as a strength anymore, and that export to the U.S. or China or imports of energy during this time is actually is a vulnerability as well. So I think what we're seeing right now with Southeast Asian country is them turning on their survival mode and trying to work more with each other and enhance, because I think in a way they do see, other fellow Southeast Asian countries as having shared interests and being more reliable somewhat than great powers who can threaten them if they see Southeast Asia as acting out of line. So actually working with powers in the region like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, working with the Philippines is, playing to, in a way preserve that interdependence, but knowing that interdependence would have less vulnerability and risk attached to it. So this is what I see the enhanced strategic partnership falls into. In the past months, we have seen To Lam made his tour around Southeast Asia, visiting, Thailand and Singapore, signing, what have amounted to, I think it was 71 cooperation agreements, and a lot of this was in the center of a lot of this is about economic cooperation and supply chain resilience and energy and food security. So I see that, at least from Hanoi perspective, particularly, it is an effort to to enhance resilience in the face of upcoming shocks and crises.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for emphasizing that this isn't, because I think from the outside, people, I mean, especially in the Philippines, people will
Yeah.
see this agreement as rooted in maritime security, maritime cooperation. But of course, there is that aspect of trade. And
Yeah.
as I think President To Lam also emphasized this, that security isn't just about military security; it's about economic security. And I just want to, like, I just remembered, not a long time ago, ASEAN leaders met in Cebu in the Philippines and agreed that ASEAN has to work together towards energy resilience, but there weren't material solutions to that agreement, which I guess is a reflection of the survival mode that you speak of, right? Like,
Yeah.
ASEAN knows it has to close ranks, but
Yeah.
maybe the methodology of actually carrying out those aspirations, as it is always in ASEAN, is much harder to imagine than the visions and the joint statements.
And like, I just think that inherently it is a difficult task. At the end of the day, you can't replace US or Chinese market with any countries in Southeast Asia. And not many of us, have sort of the resource abundance to and the processing capabilities to export fossil fuels to other countries that are in need. So I think Southeast Asian countries are also finding their way out. So what we often see they do is that they announce a particular vision, or they announce a particular partnership, and in hope that that would leave options open for them to cooperate when a crisis might strike.
Yeah. Speaking perhaps of a very realistic view of the world, and to touch on maritime disputes and maritime security, the two leaders in their joint statements made explicit mention, of course, that the Philippines and Vietnam are fellow claimant states in the South China Sea. For the most part, at least publicly, bilaterally, there is no real or alarming quarrel between the Philippines and Vietnam, right? Especially in terms of maritime delineation or overlapping claims. But the two countries obviously have very different approaches to the South China Sea when it comes, especially when you talk about managing the tensions, managing disputes. The Philippines, obviously, up until recently, perhaps has been quite transparent and loud in exposing to the world and to the region Chinese activities in the Philippine EEZ or in areas that the Philippines, China, and even Vietnam also claim, right? Vietnam has taken a very different approach. So how do we, like, from an outsider's perspective, perhaps, this is like, how do you even get along if that's the case? You don't agree on how to handle these things. But obviously, Vietnam and the Philippines are coming together and, in fact, have elevated bilateral ties. So how do you square that seeming contradiction? Or is it even a contradiction?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, and that is also something that came across my mind when I heard about the announcement of this enhanced strategic partnership. Because if you're looking solely at how the two countries are reacting to tensions in the South China Sea, you see it's almost like opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like, even though the two both share concerns for increased Chinese assertiveness in the maritime domain. On one hand, we see Vietnam rather, quiet diplomacy, efforts to address tension via bilateral ties. Domestically, it's very careful about publicizing crisis. So in comparison to the Philippines' transparency approach, it's quite a stark contrast. And if I remember correctly, there has been time when Hanoi sort of subtly call out, parties when there's, clashes between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. Hanoi has been subtly call out parties to remain, to remain calm rather than,
Avoid
blowing
escalation.
things out of proportion. And in my, observation, I see that more as a message to the Philippines than China, because Vietnam knows that, there's nothing that Vietnam can say that would make China change its behavior, right? So actually, I do see potentially that the partnership, by bringing, a country who has a different approach closer, you might have more influence or impact on what the country may view, since I guess the Philippines' approach or responses to China incursions in the South China Sea, understandably makes Hanoi worries at time, about escalation and increased tension. So maybe there's an avenue there for both sides to, have conversation and provide each other's perhaps advice about how to best manage tension. But I think, at a base level, I don't think that the two sides see this as something that they necessarily need to square, and that they understand ultimately that, we have very similar interests, in upholding rules, norms, and stability in this region. And we might have different approach to maintaining it, but I don't think that the Philippines see Vietnam's silence as necessarily a problem, nor Vietnam sees the Philippines' very, loud approach as, something that is inherently damaging to the region, because I think both countries understand that, they're not necessarily the biggest troublemaker in this region.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess it's also an acceptance that there's no real wrong approach. Each country is just trying to do its best, given obviously the material limitations, especially on the Philippine side, right?
Yeah.
And also like the geopolitical limitations in pushing back against Chinese actions in maritime spaces. I will ask you a question that I guess every single ASEAN diplomat, especially those in the Philippines, have been asked. There is an aspiration to conclude a code of conduct on the South China Sea before the year ends. Technically, I think it was supposed to be July. I don't think that's happening anytime soon, but before the year ends, before the chairmanship of Manila ends, if you ask a Filipino diplomat, they will answer you. And even I think the ASEAN Secretary General answered with, well, talks are increasing. They're happening monthly, but that's not really an answer. They're understandably, they refuse to give concrete deadlines for that conclusion, right? But for you, as an expert looking from the outside, is there truly hope for a COC by the end of 2026? And maybe to zoom out further, what does a COC do given the change in environment from the time the negotiations started with that single document and today? Because, I mean, the world has changed so much since ASEAN and China finally decided to really move forward with COC negotiations.
Yeah. Yeah, in regards to the COC, I guess my short answer for, whether or not we would see a complete COC by the end of this year is no. It'll be a major surprise if countries are able to come together and negotiate a full operating code of conduct of the South China Sea by the end of this year, considering that has already been June, and not to not to be critical of the Philippines government, but if you remember during Do Lam address, there was a little call out to the Philippines and its role as chairman of ASEAN this year, and I think it was a nod that the Philippines has been quite distracted with domestic politics so far, and there hasn't been perhaps enough efforts to drive talks and lead countries towards a conclusion of the agreement. But I mean, I guess it's helpful to keep in mind what Southeast Asian countries actually see as the advantage of a code of conduct of the COC, and from my perspective, I think they see more benefits in having the talk rather than concluding the talk. This is not a new perspective, but having China at the table, and this been communicated to me from Vietnamese diplomats, that just having China at the table, keeping it in dialogue, is a goal in itself, and it's not necessarily what is it that countries can achieve at the end of it, because frankly, even if ASEAN is able to somehow achieve a legally binding agreement, the question of implementing such legal framework would be extremely difficult, and I would say that most Southeast Asian countries actually don't have the capability, considering how much Chinese military and naval forces have modernized in the past few years, like you said, since we have the DOC or the first draft to the COC. Considering how much their capability have enhanced and how much Southeast Asian capability have not increased, it is incredibly difficult to determine things like attribution, and actually enforce the code, and with the Philippine Minister of Defense speech at the Shangri-La recently, I think he mentioned how there's a mechanism already exists in international law, in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and these are universally recognized, except for the United States, but we have existing legal mechanism already, and the COC, if you rush towards completing something just for the sake of having it completed, number one, you lose the advantage of having China on the table, being in constant dialogue, talking to you, and secondly, you might risk creating some a subpar outcome that no country would benefit from, and might it could also risk creating a different set of rules that that stronger, more powerful nations with more legal capabilities, more actual military capabilities to to take advantage of, to interpret in a ways that is going to benefit themselves, and it in that situation it'll become extremely difficult for Southeast Asian countries to deal with. So I think that the Philippines or Vietnam, to that matter, are aware of these risks. So I think that they would rather, most countries would rather drag this thing out for hopefully not another 10 years, but another couple of months, couple of years, rather than adopting something that is subpar.
I mean, because I think the logic also is that it's taken this long. Why rush now? Why rush now when everything's so uncertain, everything's so volatile? And I mean, speaking also of domestic discord, I mean, the very fact that Secretary Chodoro, as you mentioned, during Shangri-La, didn't basically call China untrustworthy in the context of COC negotiations, even as the DFA, the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Philippines, has been saying, oh, they're very open, they are committed to. So, I mean, the Vietnamese president was correct, perhaps, in pointing out also the shortcomings of Manila as chair of ASEAN. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. hopefully for our public, my public, to better understand what exactly these deals mean with Vietnam and also actually, frankly, even Japan, which was signed just 3 or 4 days before the enhanced strategic partnership with Vietnam. Again, thank you for your time. And thank you everyone for watching. You can download the Rappler app for more news and updates from the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the Asia Pacific. This is Bea Copin. Keep it on Rappler.